Hello and welcome to Wisdom Lab Rage Against the Machine, where we'll be thinking all about how we can live in a Christ-like way in a world full of technology. I'm Matt Jolly and I work in the culture and discipleship team here at LICC. Dave, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, good to join you. Dave Benson, I can already see a few familiar faces there. So I'm so glad you could join us tonight after a big day for many of you of work and other things. So good to be with you.
If you're here, you've hopefully already started thinking about technology to some extent and what it looks like to live as a disciple fruitfully in all of life, wherever you are, and how that relates to your tech use. This is what we in our work with culture and discipleship think about. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to help people navigate this cultural moment and the cultures of their front lines with wisdom. I'm just going to share screen a second. And part of how we do that is through events like this. So we run Wisdom Labs, where we look at some of the major issues facing us as a society, as people, as a church, and explore how we might respond. Tonight we'll be working through a framework, which you'll see here. So we're going to start by first listening. So we listen to each other, as you see at the bottom right, to frontline stories. We listen to the world, so culture stories. And we do that to try and understand our relationship. So for tonight, it's understanding our relationship with technology. What sort of state is it in? Dave will then help us to listen to the word. You see at the top, God's story, as we imagine what the biblical role of our technology might be. After that, we'll then think about the crucial what next question. How might we create change and communicate the good news in this technological age? So as something of a disclaimer, this event might look less like an expert speaking to an audience and more like a community wrestling together, seeking a wise way forward. It'll be practical, interactive, and hopefully by the end, you'll have clear ways in which you can implement what's been discussed. And as we look at technology, we don't just want to spend the whole time criticizing it, convincing ourselves of all the reasons that it's terrible. Instead, we actually want to find its good and its godly purpose, like making this event happen at all. So I'm currently in London, in central London, in our base, our HQ as LICC. Dave is in Amersham. You're wherever you are in the UK or even beyond. And there is a sort of irony in that we're even able to communicate at the moment. It's all very dependent on technology. So we're just about ready to jump into the listen section to begin our evening. As I said, that's where we kind of begin to try and wrap our heads around the state of our relationship with our technology. But just one more thing. When you go to the cinema, I don't know if you've done that recently. I went a week or two ago for the first time in a while, which was great. They tell you beforehand to put your phone on silent so that you can focus on what's going on. And especially as we're on Zoom, I know there's a temptation to kind of have other stuff up at the same time. It might be tempting to get distracted by your phone or whatever. Could I encourage you to maybe put it out of view or close it? It would be a little bit tragic to miss an event on tech use because you were too distracted by your tech to really engage. So that'd be great. Thank you. So without further ado, listen. So if we want to see the way that our relationship with technology is changing, we don't need to look any further than our contemporary culture, listening to culture stories as we talked about just then. Since we just, I just mentioned the cinema, I thought we could look at our films. As critics will tell us, whilst movies often capture an element of fantasy, of kind of being outside real life, they also reflect a culture's fears and concerns. And this is encapsulated in particular in the nature of movie villains. So maybe it's just because the next Bond film is set to come out in a few days' time. I'm going on Sunday, very excited. But when I thought of movie villains, this was where my mind went first. So on the left, we have Goldfinger and Thunderball, released in 1964 and 1965 respectively, with Sean Connery looking very handsome and very serious, very determined on the posters. Then on the right, there we have the more recent Bond, Skyfall, which was released in 2012. Now, in Goldfinger, our villain is Auric Goldfinger, who was apparently voted the most sinister Bond villain in all of history. At least that's what his Wikipedia page said. He's played by a German actor, and the character is originally from Eastern Europe. And what's his weapon of choice? Well, it's a nuclear bomb with which he wants to attack Fort Knox in the US. In Thunderball, the villain is Emilio Largo of the infamous terrorist organization Spectre, which Bond was still somehow fighting in the movie in 2015, not sure how. The weapon was 2 stolen atomic bombs, which they threatened to detonate over a city in either the US or the UK. Now, all of that makes sense. In the 1960s, the Cold War was kind of rumbling on, and there was a real threat of nuclear warfare. Eastern Europeans, kind of behind the Iron Curtain, were people of suspicion. And so even though the films and the books they were based on were fantasy, the villains and their weapons were credible enough to be scary, with dangers that were relatable for the audience at the time. So if we fast forward to 2012, and here's where can we bring it back to technology, what's the weapon of choice in Skyfall? What could realistically cause carnage and destruction, both in the film, but also in the real world? And you might guess where I'm going with this. Well, it's a stolen hard drive and a hack on MI6's digital infrastructure. And in the subsequent film Spectre in 2015, the villain's objective is to create an international surveillance network using data from 9 different world governments. Modern villains and the agents battling them look less like this is Goldfinger in his lair with Bond, and more like this behind a laptop. And the good guys, as well as jumping onto trains and out of helicopters, find themselves staring nervously at computers, this is from Skyfall, in the ultra high-tech MI6 HQ. So these films reflect the increasingly prominent and dangerous role that technology plays in our world. And there's obviously so many different directions that we could go with this, and so many different facets of modern technology that we could look at, from AI to surveillance and big data to cryptocurrency. And we'll hopefully look at some of these topics in the coming months. In fact, almost every area of modern life has a technological dimension, but we thought that we'd look at our phone use. So why is that? Well, our phones are always with us, from work to time with friends and family, at home, at school, at church, with us in our rooms as we sleep. I'm willing to bet they're probably within arm's reach for you right now, or at least close by. As a result, they're present on all our front lines as well, completely embedded within our everyday lives. So they're perfect for this kind of explicitly everyday focus that we want to have for this Wisdom Lab today. In fact, to give you a little bit of light relief early on, here's some cartoons that detail just how ever present our phones have become, even in some situations that they really don't belong in. So on the left, we have people who have ended up with horrendous tan lines because they've clearly been scrolling through their phones while sunbathing on holiday. In the middle, a woman who seems to be absolutely snapping with her husband over his insistence to look on his phone rather than her during a conversation. And then on the right, we've got a guy who's sitting on a park bench, completely missing what's going on around him because he's absorbed by his phone. And then this is my personal favorite on there. I don't know if you've ever completely missed something someone was saying to you because you were on your phone. Yes, it drives me nuts when people do it to me. And yes, I've also done it plenty of times myself, though thankfully no one's ever left me over it. But as well as being ever present and having such power to affect our lives, we also have, in theory, a large amount of control over how we use our phones. Though people do use their phones to work, most of what we use them for are actually leisure time activities. So there's rarely a contractual obligation for us to be on our phones, as opposed to, say, a work laptop, where we don't really have a choice over whether we use it during the workday. So we have the power to reform the use of our phones, to even switch them off from time to time, something which is becoming an increasingly scary thought to even do. So I was born in 1997, which is the year that Gen Z, or iGen, as they've been called, supposedly began. So I speak as someone who's kind of a digital native, who has grown up with smartphones, although not entirely. So my first phone wasn't actually a smartphone at all. It was a Nokia brick, which I actually really miss. I love Nokia bricks. I didn't actually get a smartphone until I was about 14, which by today's standards is actually quite late. According to my screen time app, I spend just over 2 hours a day on my phone, which maybe makes me about average for this group potentially. Although I think it's a lot. It's less than it used to be, but I think it's still quite a lot. Assuming I'm awake for 16 hours a day, that's 1/8 of my waking life spent looking at my phone. But I don't know where you fall in that kind of number of hours a day, whether you're 2 hours, a bit less, a bit more. But if you're 2 hours, you're actually below average. According to a Guardian article from 2019, global iPhone users spent an average of 3.25 hours on their phone each day. And as a result of COVID and the increasing reliance on virtual connection as we've gone through lockdowns, that number's climbed a bit. In 2021, the global average was 4 hours for phone use each day, although UK phone users are doing a bit better, averaging a mere 3.5 hours each day on our phones. And on top of that, we pick up our phones around 58 times a day, which is about once every 15 minutes. And sadly, it's not in our downtime. Interesting that someone said they tend to use their phone in their work time. I don't know if that's for work or as a distraction, but apparently 70% of people keep their phone within eye contact as they work, me included. Sorry about that, Dave. And you can easily find many more of these scary stats, appropriately enough, online. Before we get too far down this road and begin to think that we should just throw our phone in the bin and just leave it there, let's backtrack a little bit. As well as thinking about how much we use our phones, it's also important to consider what we use them for. A lot of people there just mentioned lots of apps they really enjoy on their phones. They're for different ways in which it serves a hobby or it's really, really practical. And this brings us to what John Dyer calls the 3 stories of technology, which we'll look at in turn. And it starts by considering how we use our tech. And when we do that, we discover there is so much we can praise God for. In many ways, our phones are getting better and better. So I can fit my phone in my pocket, and yet, as I said, it can help me navigate the entire globe by communicating with satellites hundreds of miles away. It can order pretty much anything to my door. It can access an ocean of information on the internet and connect me to people on the other side of the world, almost like they're sitting next to me. How many of us were grateful for that during months of lockdown? And as you joined this Zoom call, you might have seen this image. We've used it for all our digital events over the last 18 months, as Zoom has allowed people from all over the country and beyond to attend things with LICC they would never get to in person. And think about technology more widely. Advancements have allowed massive steps forward in medical diagnostics, steps forward in battling climate change. You can really go on and on. As much as we might dislike even marketing cookies and the amount of data that's kind of gathered and harvested on us, when I was looking to buy new running trainers recently, even that was actually really useful for directing me towards what I was after. But alongside these great uses, there's also other ways in which we use our phones that are unnecessary at best and unhealthy at worst. Endless scrolling, escapism that doesn't bring true rest, distraction from the task that need doing or from the person in front of us, or even uses that bring us towards what this guy seems to be doing, looking at the blue light of our phones when we should probably be sleeping. And this brings us to the second story, which sometimes isn't as clear: the ways in which our tech affects us in return. For the most heartbreaking example of this, just think of the rising rates of reported mental health amongst Gen Z, the most technologically active generation. But it's not just about using our phones in the wrong way. Such a view assumes that our tech is neutral, that it doesn't lead us in any direction, that it's just up to us to use our devices in a good way. And maybe it's not that simple. Our phones and the apps on them, much like any technology, bring with them a worldview. As Marshall McLuhan famously put it, the medium is the message. We may only see our devices as mediums for finding and sending information, but they carry their own message about how the world should be and how we should exist within it. Now, if that sounds a little bit complex, then maybe an analogy will help. I don't know if you've used Play-Doh recently, but I just about remember playing with it as a kid. So when I was little, I also had this toy with different shaped holes around it. And when I pushed the Play-Doh through, each hole would cut the dough into a different shape, like a square, circle, or triangle. And so what came out would still be Play-Doh, but it would look different depending on the hole it had come through. And perhaps a similar thing is going on with our technology. When we talk to other people through our phones, whether it's via WhatsApp or pictures or a phone call, we're taking the richness of our experiences, thoughts, and emotions, all of human communication, and compressing them to fit the method of communication we're using at that time. So what comes out might be the same essential information, but it's had to fit the contours of the medium we've used, and it's often poorer as a result. Social scientists tell us that even video calls, maybe the closest our phones can get to in-person connection, miss out on much of our non-verbal body language. That's why Zoom fatigue is real. Over time, as we get increasingly used to conversing through our phones, we gradually get more adept at communicating in this slightly condensed way and less able to convey what we want to say in a deeper and more meaningful way. If to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, then maybe to the person with a phone, everything looks like a text message. Or to someone on Twitter, every complex, nuanced argument can be reduced to a slogan that's 280 characters or less. And that's not to say that communicating through phones is bad, but just that compared to in-person connection, it's limited. And we'll come back to this idea later. Now, if you're not sure what the message of a particular piece of technology is, just look at the way it most naturally tends to be used, what it makes easier and what it makes much harder. So for example, let's come back to our phones again. Phones make it a lot easier to stay in touch with friends through numerous messaging apps. However, it also makes it much more difficult to disconnect from the outside world. So the message might be that we should always be reachable, but only via kind of virtual communication. My phone's service provider is EE, which if you weren't aware is an acronym, it's short for everything everywhere, which is a pretty strong message about what we should want and what we should expect from our phones. But would you agree with that message? Phones make it nearly impossible to focus on the task at hand at times. I know I find this through many different apps and a constant stream of notifications which tap into an evolutionary impulse to shift focus quickly. I'm distracted by this kind of endless stream of angry tirades on Facebook, a distant friend's holiday pictures on Instagram, and funny cat videos on Twitter. And the message there might be that we should multitask and receive a constant flow of information, but not dwell or reflect on any of it for too long, apparently shortening our attention span down to a matter of seconds. We've got loads of content to keep us entertained, and the result is that we seem to now actually get bored faster than ever before in human history. In fact, Pete Dunlap has pointed out that the lack of a real keyboard on smartphones suggests they're primarily for consuming media. As he says, great at typing out snippets, but poor at doing anything complex or meaningful. So our tech and social media, which is particularly formative, is affecting us. And as you kind of maybe get a sense of from this cartoon, that we think we're giving our phones kind of commands and we're telling it to get emails and to take us places and show us things. And that is true. But what if there's also an element where actually it's making demands on us that we might not be seeing as much? These graphs are from Jean Tweng's research. Hopefully you can see those. So I mentioned her research in the first long form article, and she's a sociologist, she's from America, and she looks at kind of generational trends, which recently has meant that she's been looking a lot at technology as it's so influential over Gen Z. So these three graphs, they track in-person connection, so like meeting up with friends, loneliness, and sleep for teenagers across the noughties. In 2007, as the smartphone era began with the advent of the iPhone, you can see these trends just accelerate. The most digital of all generations has, as we said, the highest rates of reported mental health issues as comparison, loneliness, and sleeplessness skyrocket with increased screen use and decreased in-person contact. I'm not saying that's all to do with technology, but there is a correlation there. We'll get to the imagine section where we begin to place our phones within the context of God's mission in a moment. But first, here's the third story, which is perhaps the hardest to pick up on. This is where we're formed at the deepest level by our technology. The effect of living in a world where tech and the underlying messages that come with it is everywhere. Neil Postman looks at this a lot in his book, Technopoly. He suggests that in the modern world, even our values and beliefs have been shaped by technology. So new equals better, and constant upgrades are required. Our idea of the good is shaped by technology, so now we aim for progress, efficiency, increased ease and convenience, what Andy Crouch calls easy everywhere, where everything we could ever want is at our fingertips. And if we're not satisfied by the tech that's serving up this easy everywhere, the solution often isn't to question whether this is actually what we should be aiming towards, whether this is actually what leads to true satisfaction, but to simply get different tech. For example, when I bought my new phone back in March because my previous 3-year-old one wasn't working well anymore, planned obsolescence means that actually things are now designed to break, so we need to buy new stuff. I wanted something that worked quickly, that would bring the internet to the palm of my hand, that would take world-class nighttime time-lapse photos, that would have room for more apps than I could ever use. And would this better? Would that be better than the Nokia I had as my first phone? Well, that depends what you mean by better. And to answer that, we need to ask where we really want to be headed. And for us, the key question is how is this forming me as a disciple of Christ? And we've written a little bit about what it means to be a disciple of Christ in a long form blog post, which might come into the chat. To answer the question of how it's forming us, we need to understand what it looks like to grow in Christ. And to do this, we need to rediscover a set of values that are based not on our technology, but are drawn from Scripture, and to understand the biblical role of tech within God's mission. We need to listen to the word, which Dave will now help us to do. So Dave, I wonder if you want to take over there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt. And again, for those who have just come in a bit later, thank you for putting aside the time to join us tonight. Just so that you're aware of how the night works, we call it a wisdom lab because the aim is not simply for us to talk at you, to lecture, but basically to provoke and then to open up some discussion. So just so you've got a heads up on how it's going to work, the first half leading up to the break will be a lot more presentation. The second half after the break, so probably from 8:05 onwards, will be very interactive, lots of group time, trying to form our own practices. So if you're at the end of a long day and like myself, your concentration span is waning, do stick with us, and after the break, we'll get into some more discussion. So I want to move into the imagine phase in a moment. And Matt's already shared so much with us. So I can already feel my rage against the machine building. But before I jump into the imagine phase, I want to rewind and recap a little bit of what I've heard so far. So I'm going to be entirely transparent with you in this media age, and I'm going to tell you the two main things that I got out of the listen movement from Matt. And Matt, these aren't a backhanded compliment, but I'm just going to put it straight out there and let everyone know. So the first thing I got out of Matt's listen stage was a shocking degree of conviction. I got to be honest, I actually feel like a massive hypocrite speaking tonight. So thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Now, you see, it was only back in 2013 that I wrote a blog called A Label I'm Learning to Embrace. And you may not be able to guess the label, but this picture gives it away that you might see on your screen there. The label was Luddite. Could you just wave at the camera if you've heard the word Luddite and you know what that means? Great. I can see Alec and a couple of others waving there. So a Luddite, if you've heard that phrase, just a few weeks back, I visited Nottingham. Went up to Nottingham Castle, said hi to Robin Hood and the crew. And this is where the famed Ned Ludlam lived in Nottingham. And the infamous Luddites got their name in the early 1800s. Long story short, Ned Ludlam, this is who it's about, but Ned's dad asked him to fix a malfunctioning weaving machine. But instead, Ludlam Jr. destroyed the devilish device. And he said it was devilish because between 1811 and 1816, this contraption had replaced skilled fabric workers, resulted in wage cuts, child labor, unemployment, widespread discontent. It's like the automation that we're facing at the moment in some ways. And ever since then, the term Luddite has come to mean an almost childish and certainly a naive opposition to technology. Now, I was called a Luddite, dear, that hurt, but I was called a Luddite by my best friend for refusing to have a mobile phone back in 2013. And worse, I confessed to my desire to smash the devilish device when it beeped and rattled, it pinged and alerted, even while attached to the arm of a loved one. And so here's what was going on, because I could see that life, BME, have you heard that? We know AD, BCE. Well, BME is before mobiles existed. And I could see that life, BME, was in many ways better. BME, my yes was a yes, my no was a no. I was organized enough to turn up when I said I would, and I wouldn't hold off to see if a better social offer came my way that forced a last-minute change of plan. BME, I could hold a sustained conversation without interruption, eye contact and all, without my best friend glancing under the table to text his girlfriend. True story. Now, I was also BME. You could track me down in the case of an emergency. So no one was freaking out. I mean, I was accessible, but I wasn't so convenient that you would divulge trivial details better kept to yourself, or treat me like a tool to accomplish tasks truly your own. Can you remember these good days? Can you remember these good old days, BME? Well, here's the hypocrisy here, because 8 years on, I've massively sold out. I have a smartphone ever present in my pocket. These are my hours on the phone, but I'm not actually on the phone. I just have it on all day using alarms. So I'll talk about that later, how I use alarms. So it looks like I spend my whole day literally with it in front of me. But I resemble what I once critiqued. I recently won the LICC award for the most Facebook posts since lockdown began. Ashamed to confess that it was well over 1,000 in a year. But in my defense, they are mostly scripture set on a pretty nature backdrop. So I don't know, does that balance it up? I'm not sure. But thank you, Matt, for your conviction, because this smartphone effect has impacted my friendships, loneliness, and definitely my sleep. And I'm not even close to being iGen. So maybe I'm feeling younger, I don't know. But the first thing I felt was conviction. But the second thing that I got out of Matt's listen movement was a massive temptation, a temptation to watch another Bond movie. I don't know if anyone's with me there, but it's been 600 days since it was supposed to be released. That's quite the wait. And I naughtily checked my phone during your address, Matt, and I found out that it premieres 3 sleeps away. And there are a few things that I like more than action movies and larger than life baddies on the big screen. But even there, if you've been to the cinemas, you know that the cinema world was way better BME. But more on that in a second. Now, in a moment, I'm going to build this theology. I'm going to outline a cinematic take on the big story of the Bible, because we need to get our bearings here. And I'm going to retell this sweeping tale right from the beginning of creation through to the present. And this will raise a bunch of questions that we'll discuss as we seek to imagine what should be going on in this high-tech world, and how to use our smartphones rather than being used by them. But first, we're going to watch a 2-minute clip from another British action man who I really do hope replaces Daniel Craig in due time. This is John Boyega, and he shows just how much things have changed in our everyday lives and even our movie watching now that mobiles exist. And I wonder, maybe it's time that we all powered down and looked up to see our screen addiction from a divine angle. But to do that, we need to get lost in the greatest story of them all, the biblical story. So Andy's just going to play a 2-minute clip, and then after that, I'm going to build a theology of technology.
So, stories. The story is that they are everywhere. And you can broadcast them to the entire world from the palm of your hand. I mean, yeah, you saw a sunset, you saw a dog, you saw a flower. And yes, you bought breakfast, you bought a coffee, you bought a sandwich. I'll have what he's having. And okay, now you can tell your stories in 10 seconds, 6 seconds, 3-second disappearing stories? Huh, cute dog. But come on, to lose yourself in the story, you have to do it properly.
Action!
Hang on. Ah! Not like that. Or that. Or that. Definitely not like that. Great stories are the ones you can lose yourself in. You You can't do it like that.
Hi, Dad.
No, to really lose yourself in a story, it means no pings, no alerts, no click me, swipe me, like me's. Feels good, doesn't it? Imagine what 2 hours feels like.
That's a great clip, Andy. Great clip. And thanks for sharing that. So it is time now for us to build a theology for how to rage against the machine. It is time to cue and get lost in the greatest story of them all. So let me share that with you. So where shall we start? Well, in the beginning. In the beginning, God planted a garden and he put us in it. Be fruitful and multiply, he said. And this is the only command we've consistently kept with a smile. But God continued, fill the earth and subdue it. And this is our first mission in the world. As the Lord God tends and cares for us, we are to tend and care for his garden. And when we garden God's way, we mirror his image to all of creation. And God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Now, I'm not much of a gardener, neither of my thumbs is particularly green, but I want you to notice what God didn't say. He didn't tell us to wander among the trees, el natural, grabbing fruit off the garden floor and leaving only footprints. You see, gardening means getting your hands dirty. And God didn't tell us to garden without a rake. Cultivating is hard work and it takes tools. In due time, Adam and Eve's descendants would use picks and shovels, jackhammers and jumper leads, power tools, and personal computers. And to varying degrees, God still pronounces our machine making very good. You see, when our technology connects us in love to God and our neighbor, and it facilitates a better use of our gifts to make something great of the planet, then it gets a big thumbs up from the cloud above. You see, then our lives image our designer, for we are made like an app to function as God's icon. We're made to create love and cultivate earth. And cultivation lies behind culture. We're culture makers. You see, it's no coincidence that the biblical story starts in a garden, and as we mentioned with John Dye's book, it ends in a landscaped city. And if you're a horticulturalist, culture again, you know that tending the earth takes study and technique. It's not technology free. Science and technology are part of God's plan to bless the world and to reflect his image. So technology is not the problem. The issue is how we journey from the garden to the city. On that tragic day when we ate the forbidden fruit, and surely it was an apple, technology became both a blessing and a curse. Would our techniques to form and transform the world, would they magnify or would they mutilate the image of God in us? So these are the kind of questions we should ask. Do our devices draw us into God's presence, or do they depress our desire for his kingdom? Are they helping us look up at God, out at our neighbor, and down at the garden we work? Or are they simply reflecting us back to what we want to see? A digital pool where the modern Narcissus goes to forget his sorrows and drown in his own status. Now, pretty much everything we see in this Zoom room is touched by technology. If we stripped it all away, disturbing thought warning, you would be sitting naked on the ground, staring at your monitor or communication device like a black mirror, alone in the dark. So we can't just get annoyed at technology. We actually need to see the role that it plays. You see clothes, books, projectors, iPhones, monitors, moisturizers. It's all part of technology. And each of us draws the line at some point. In Amish communities, for instance, you may know this, that your clothes can feature buttons, but not zippers. Why? Well, because you can make buttons, but you've got to buy zippers because of the technology. And they want everything to be contained within their community that they can fix, repair, replace. So that's where they draw the line. But it can seem like a game of semantics. I'm good with FPOS, but I won't use email. Well, Facebook is fine, but Twitter, that wastes time. Tetris is entertaining, but God of War and Fortnite, they are evil. Or let's talk about apps. Dark Sky and Google Maps, they're life hack apps. They make life better, but Instagram and Snapchat, surely they're Satan's snare. And as for YouTube and Netflix, where did my life go? Just one more binge and I promise I'll get off the couch, I'll wash the dishes, I'll welcome home my loved one, I'll work up an exercise sweat, and then I will write that poignant haiku poem just when I get over the technology. You use zippers, but I stick to buttons. And the point is that there's no easy answers. But have we unplugged and powered down for long enough to get a fresh perspective? Do we unthinkingly upgrade with the crowd? Can we hear God's still small voice calling to us to be a counterculture? So what would Jesus do? Or what would Jesus play? Can you picture Jesus updating his online profile while WhatsApping Peter to see if there's a better social offer than serving bread and fish to 5,000? Or can you see Jesus, this might be lost on a few of you if you don't play Fortnite, but could you see Jesus dancing on Thomas's virtual grave after winning a round of Battle Royale? Maybe, maybe not. But how would Jesus live in our digital world? These are difficult questions. An old Chinese proverb, perhaps a little bit cliche, but it says that if you want to know about the water, don't ask a fish. And I don't know if you've noticed, but each of us is immersed in an electric ocean. As Matt mentioned, the average young adult crams nearly 9 hours of media content, music, television, videos, internet, and movies, almost all accessed on their smartphone. They cram these 9 hours into 7 hours exposure per day, multitasking or badly tasking multiple things at the same time. So our task in this next little while is to seek an out-of-water experience. If we are seriously about following Jesus as whole life disciples, if we're seriously about seeking first his kingdom, then how should we live in an electronic environment? How do we image God in a high-tech world rather than just cultivating our own reflection? Now, every single person here has experienced how your device, your mobile phone or your computers, how it's been a blessing in so many ways, such as us connecting together tonight. There's no surprises there. But what we often struggle to see is how these devices, particularly our smartphones, how we take them for granted and they're actually a two-edged sword. So what we're going to do now is switch gears and explore a range of perspectives through a biblical lens, imagining what should be going on. What does faithful use actually look like? And the key question to ask yourself is this: does my mobile use magnify or mutilate the image of God in me? Does my mobile use magnify or mutilate the image of God in me? How would Jesus have me live? So it's not mobile versus no mobile. It's how does my use impact me as an image bearer? So to answer that question, we need a picture of where the biblical story, the biblical epic ends. And it starts in a garden, but the story ends in a garden city, a landscaped garden. It ends with humans fully grown up in virtue, so that we look like our Savior. We're characterized by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The fruit of the Spirit are really helpful in looking at how our technology forms or deforms us. And so if you can picture this garden city, that it's populated by people who are authentic and truthful. They're never pretending to be something they're not, as devices come between us and our neighbors and the God we worship. So all of our best gifts are passed through the fire and are brought into the New Jerusalem as a tribute to God. And so I wonder, if iPhones were to make it through the final judgment, I suspect that the home screens and the apps which feature will be radically reconfigured. It won't be business as usual. But either way, we will be running on a far better operating system. And we'll have the discernment and the moderation to use any technology in a way that actually helps us better love God, our neighbor, and cultivate the new creation. So these are some criteria by which we might judge how our technology is affecting us. We might ask how our mobile use right now grows us toward the vision of the new humanity, or it takes us away to some kind of lesser life where instead we play God, we ignore our neighbor, we damage the planet by squandering our gifts as we stare endlessly at a screen, and we pile these obsolescent devices into an ever larger landfill. So the last point then before we discuss it. So the Imagine movement is about seeking biblical wisdom. It's about evaluating our current practice and saying what should be going on. Does our smartphone use, for instance, lead towards relationships and valuing our bodies in face-to-face encounters? Or does it put a distance between us, like this Ogilvy ad campaign? The more we connect, the less we connect. Maybe our devices actually put a barrier between us and our loved ones so that we escape the mess of real life. Or do our devices lead us to creatively engage the world and use our gifts to make our front lines better? Or do they form us as passive consumers, amused to death by ever-present entertainment? And how does my daily phone use contribute to meaningful work? Or does it tempt me to play a kind of omnipresent God, knowing everything, being everywhere, multitasking without focus and diffusing my efforts until productivity grinds to a halt? So these three areas we'll return to throughout tonight. Creativity, does it turn us outwards? Work, does it cultivate the world in meaningful ways? And relationships, does it draw us into reciprocity? And that's central to Imagine a Better Way to Be.
So we've now considered the nature of our relationship with our phones as it is. We've listened, and we've also imagined what it should be with Dave. So thank you for that. And the next step is, as we've said, to think about how we'll respond. How and when should we use our phones? And Dave's just put in the chat a part 2 of a long form blog series that we put together in preparation for this, which really drills down into the create and the communicate steps in a bit more detail. But we'll do that now as well. And it's also worth noting that though we are speaking about phones, I'm sure you realize this, but this framework can guide our interaction with all kinds of technology. So first we discern the values and the message of the tech in question, as we did in the listen step, or maybe it's the app that we're thinking about. And then we compare this to the values and the message of scripture that Dave's just pointed us to, with the ways in which we're created to work, to be creative, for relationship, and so on. And then when they overlap, we think about where they overlap and we think about where they diverge. The more they overlap, the more we maybe should use that technology, and the less they overlap, the less so. And by looking at where they overlap, we can also gauge how we should use that technology. And at this point, we often talk of how we can water, weed, and weave. So we water what's good, where God's creational intent is fulfilled. We weed what goes against God's purposes, looking to restrain that cultural idolatry that Dave was just talking about. And we weave something new, a godly alternative to the common way of doing things. So we can look at particular biblical values that are encouraged by that technology, which we want to water and help grow. Where do they help us to do meaningful work, be creative, and form deep relationships? Or we might find places where what we use actually forms us in that different direction. This is where we want to weed and thwart what's not of God. Where do they distance us from the people around us, lead us towards loneliness or distraction or escapism or kind of passive consumption, which we can so often be led into, where we kind of don't realize how, but somehow hours have passed by and we've not really done anything meaningful. And in a minute, we'll do this together as we think about our phones. And then we weave something new, so a new set of practices or new actions which can prayerfully be enacted in community, helping us to more faithfully live in a way that reflects the kingdom. But why do we require new actions rather than just new ways of thinking? I found it really interesting what someone just said just then, that what they know is one thing, but what they do is often a very, very different matter. Because we all know, but it's not enough to just think about the way that we should use our phones as if coming to kind of a theoretical conclusion will be enough for our actions to then line up. Instead, we need that practical response. In prepping for this event, I read a Guardian article where the author spoke to her friends about how much they use their phones. They were almost all aware of how much they were on their phone. They knew it probably wasn't good. They knew they probably should try and use their phones a bit less or use their phones differently, but they were still doing it. And I can relate. Each week, my phone tells me how many hours a day I'm on it. That's the kind of feature of iPhones nowadays. And yet week after week, often not a lot changes. If we just look back at those cartoons again from the start, part of why they're funny is probably because you might have been in a similar situation at some point, or you can kind of relate to someone who might have been in a similar situation. You might not have got those horrific tan lines, but you may well have used your phone in a way that disrupted a time of rest or where you wanted to be doing something else. You might not have come out with that kind of stinging one-liner of the woman in the middle, but you'll almost certainly have had a conversation with someone else who's paying more attention to the screen in their lap than they are to you. And you might not have quite sat on a park bench that's that yellow, but you might have missed an opportunity to gaze in awe at the beauty of creation because you were on a phone. And I know that I've done all these things, but I do love that there's people who mentioned earlier that their favorite app on their phone is kind of their OS maps or things that help them to kind of do outdoor stuff and to really engage with God's creation in an active way rather than being distracted from it, where you're kind of more focused on the tweeting in your palm rather than the tweeting coming from the trees. But we're clearly not alone. There's a world of articles out there. From Time Magazine to the New York Times to a website called Clever Girl Finance that I found, where you can read about how to use your phone in a more healthy way. There's a few headlines there, but there's many others. A quick Google search of how do I use my phone less yields 15.3 billion results. Talk about information overload. As much of this advice is actually really good, but things don't just change through increasing our understanding of what we should do. Instead, we're like this girl with her dog, and I really love this photo, so I just had to get it in there. Our brains might be rationally kind of pulling us one way as this girl has the lead, but our hearts and our actions kind of remain stubbornly unmoved. Instead, we need change from the bottom up by changing our actions, reforming our practices, and so over time, adopting new habits, we can transform our relationship with our phones into a more godly one. And then eventually, instead of unthinkingly opening our phones, pulling them out from our pockets without really knowing what we meant to do or why, which is actually a surprisingly common trait, we'll instead naturally focus in conversations. We'll develop unconscious habits which form us as disciples. Two books that are really good on this are Andy Crouch's Techwise Family, I don't know if you've read that, or The Common Rule by Justin Whitmore Early. And to hear more about the Common Rule, you can come to our open book on the topic, which is happening throughout the rest of the autumn. Subtle plug there. So I'll mainly focus for now on Andy Crouch here. His book is all about how we can, especially within a family environment or the home, put tech in its proper place, though the principles do work elsewhere as well. So it's proper place where it's serving the purposes that we want it to serve, that it's godly purpose, and leading us in a direction we want to go when we're being formed as disciples, or as Dave said, we're being, the image of God in us is being magnified. And he helpfully divides the actions that we might take into nudges and disciplines. So nudges are changes we can make in our environment, like leaving our phone at home if we don't need it, or putting it out of eyesight, or facing the screen down, or even setting time limits for apps. I wanted to use my phone less before bed and first thing in the morning, for example. And so I've just started leaving it in the kitchen when I go to sleep. It's remarkably effective because whilst if my phone is on my bedside table, I might just absentmindedly reach over and start scrolling. If it's on the other side of the flat, I really can't be bothered to get out of bed and walk all the way over there. These changes to our environment change the path of least resistance. They make the automatic or the easy choice one that we want to make. But they do have their limits. Sometimes we need discipline or the moral courage to choose that maybe difficult, maybe inconvenient path because we know that it's leading us towards what's right. And this is actually especially difficult because although inconvenience and discomfort are often the areas in which we grow, how many of us have grown in some ways over the last couple of years through a lot of inconvenience and not little discomfort, it's also the route where we're conditioned to avoid at all costs. as our tech instead makes everything more convenient and so teaches us to value what makes us comfortable. Discipline, therefore, might look like closing the app that we know we've started using a bit too much, choosing to engage ourselves with a book rather than passively consuming YouTube videos when we want to relax, or even actually choosing boredom sometimes. John Mark Comer in The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which I'm sure you've heard of, suggests occasionally choosing the longest queue of traffic, or maybe arriving early to meet someone and intentionally not taking something we can distract ourselves with. And as we deny ourselves the need to be constantly entertained by things, we actually end up less bored. Before we had the kind of entertainment industry that's developed over the past few centuries, past few decades, boredom wasn't really a thing in the same way as it is today. We could try maybe practicing a tech Sabbath to rest, or deleting the apps that we maybe don't need to try and practice simplicity with our home screen. But more than just using them less, there's also a meaningful but limited role for our phones and apps to play in helping to form us as disciples. Perhaps on social media, we might seek out more direct and embodied connection. I know a couple of people have mentioned something like this already, where we use it not just to kind of indirectly scroll, disconnecting from the people around us, but actually we intentionally try to organize to meet people or call or message. And as we do that, we prioritize real relationship. Perhaps it's posting in a way that involves creativity and beauty, or looking at content online to try and find the kind of godly sense of joy and wonder. I know at the start of the evening, I mentioned that the focus of these Wisdom Labs is to not just kind of bring about that internal change in our own lives, but to live in a different and distinct way, kind of on our front lines, the everyday places that we meet people who don't know Jesus. And it might seem at first that these practices and actions kind of start internally, and they just refer to our own relationship with our phones, but they do then have a frontline impact and affect the way we live in day-to-day situations. So for example, when we restrain the desire to look inwards towards our own convenience, we're better placed to look outwards to the needs of our neighbor. Or when we limit our screen time or get better at putting our phone away or out of sight, we're better able to be present with the friend in front of us. I know a few people have mentioned that. Or when we intentionally maybe use our social media to create a diverse community where there's different views and maybe even disagreeing views that are present, we may be even then able better to disagree with our family or our housemates in a Christ-like manner. Or when we're in healthy rhythms of work and rest, we can live distinctly in a hurried and exhausted work environment. Or when we post in a way that magnifies the beauty of God's creation, we're able to point others to that beauty. When we use technology in a way that magnifies the image of God in us and serves its purposes, we can demonstrate that different and better story. We can weave something new to those around us, living wisely in a technologically saturated world. And that brings us to our final section, which I'm just going to cover briefly. You can find out more on this. This is the communicate section. You can find out more in the long form blog that's on our website, which will go into more detail. But just here, I thought it'd be good to end by thinking about the ways in which we can use that technology, actually to be good news, to share the good news. So our phones can be in and of themselves a really meaningful front line. We found this during the pandemic especially, but it's actually true even post-pandemic, and I use those with scare quotes hesitantly. We can share the gospel with other people online. A large amount of communication does happen virtually. So whether it's we've seen Zoom Church, online alpha courses, common threads of Facebook, Instagram posts, all these online platforms can be used to communicate the gospel. I even saw a friend who set his background on his phone that just saying pray more, which both reminded him to pray, but also served as an opportunity to, as 1 Peter says, to give an answer to everyone who asks you about the hope you have. Anyone who sees his phone then sees that he's encouraging himself to pray more, and maybe that's a conversation that would start where he could share the gospel. So I think we'll bring it to a close there. Thank you so much for joining us for this evening, but thank you so much for coming, and have a great evening.